dancer that, or thinker that dances. He doesn't trust the thinker that doesn't dance. And Ananya Kabir is excellent in dancing, and she'll be telling us more about her projects like Allegro Politics and others. Ari Gautier, I got to know as someone who is a novelist, but a novelist in the fashion of Edouard Glissant. This is a novelist that refuses boundaries and the question of bondage. So when you read his novels, and one of his French novels, Le Tinaille, will be translated in English, coming out soon. When you read this, you will recognize that you're reading poetry, but also philosophy and prose at one and the same time. So mixing and troubling all the boundaries. Now, the Atelier KITLV, and I should mention the president and the vice president of this, Atelier KITLV was organized, taught out with Esther Captain, who was here, who's a senior research fellow at the Royal Academy, and she does work on post-colonialism, and Marika Bloemberger, who is here, or she's coming. She's a professor at the University of Leiden. Then there's David Kloos, there is Tibisai Sankatseng, and who does work on cultural heritage and science communication. And there's Alison Fisher, who does work on the intersection between racial thinking and the law. So we have a mix of various persons who are part of the Atelier KITLV. And it is actually to blur, let's say, the 19th century boundaries between science and art, or science and spirituality, or science and journalism, or science and activism. So it's the blurring of all of these. And lastly, let me just mention Evie Evans is here because Frame of Framed is in the house, and Frame of Framed is a partner of Atelier KITLV, and we will be working through the various discussions. So today is a webinar, but next time we'll be dancing in these because we'll have Kassav here, and that will be a brilliant event. But let's start today with the event of Ananya and Ari, the webinar. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Francio. We are really grateful to you. We are very happy to bring you some of our work in the form of 3 interlinked events, of which we will do for the Atelier, and this is the first of the 3. So Ari and I, we have our conversation for everybody prepared, but we want to start with a little clip, 3 minutes, which Yaya has kindly agreed to show from her screen. So when we see that, we'll start after we finish that clip.
ഇതൊരു തീരദേശ മേഖലയിലേക്ക് വന്നൊരു കഥയാണല്ലോ. അതായത് കൊല്ലം തുടങ്ങി നമ്മുടെ വിവാഹം വരെ ലാറ്റിൻ കാത്തലിക്കിന്റെ ഒരു സംഭവമായിട്ടാണ് ഈ കഥ വന്നത്. പോർച്ചുഗീസ് മിഷണറിമാരുടെ കേരളത്തിൽ അന്നത്തെ ക്രിസ്തീയ ദേവാലയങ്ങളിലൊന്നും പ്രോഗ്രാമുകൾ അവതരിപ്പിക്കാനുള്ള ക്രിസ്തീയ കഥകളൊക്കെ കുറവുകളായിരുന്നു. മറ്റുള്ള കൂത്തും കഥകളിയും അങ്ങനെയുള്ള സംഭവങ്ങളൊക്കെയാണ് പള്ളികളിലൊക്കെ അറിയാം. അങ്ങനെയാണ് ഈ ചവിട്ട് നാടകം ഒരു 500 വർഷങ്ങൾക്ക് മുൻപ് പോർച്ചുഗീസുകാരാണ് ഈ നാടകത്തിനെ ഇങ്ങോട്ട് കൊണ്ടുവരുന്നത്. ഇവിടെ എല്ലാവരും ഞങ്ങള് നിർമ്മാണ തൊഴിലാളികളാണ് ഭൂരിഭാഗം ആളുകൾ. ഞങ്ങൾ ഒരു 6-7 മണിയൊക്കെ ആകുമ്പോൾ എല്ലാവരും 7-7:30 വന്ന് കൂടും. പിന്നെ ഇതിന്റെ പ്രദേശത്തിലാണ് നമുക്ക് ഏത് നാടകം, നമ്മൾ ഇതൊക്കെ വർഷങ്ങളായിട്ട് ചെയ്യുന്ന നാടകമാണെങ്കിൽ ഒരു പ്രോഗ്രാം വന്ന ഒരാഴ്ച 2 ആഴ്ച ആ പ്രോഗ്രാമിന് വേണ്ടി റിഹേഴ്സൽ എല്ലാവർക്കും അറിയാവുന്നതാണെങ്കിലും റിഹേഴ്സൽ നമ്മൾ കംപ്ലീറ്റ് വെക്കും. പുതിയ നാടകങ്ങളൊക്കെ ആണെങ്കിൽ 6 മാസമൊക്കെ ശരിക്കും നല്ല പ്രാക്ടീസ് തന്നെ വേണ്ടി. നാട്ടിലെ സ്റ്റേജ് എന്ന് വെച്ചാൽ 2.5 മണിക്കൂറൊക്കെ നിൽക്കുന്ന ഫുൾ സ്റ്റേജ് ആയിക്കോട്ടെ. അത് ഫുൾ സെറ്റ് ഇട്ടാണ് നമ്മൾ ചെയ്യുന്നത്. ഒരു രാജകൊട്ടാരമാണെങ്കിൽ കാർസ്മാന്റെ കൊട്ടാരമാണെങ്കിൽ കാർസ്മാന്റെ കൊട്ടാരമായിട്ട് തന്നെ കാണിക്കും. പിന്നെ അത് മറ്റേ രാജാവിന്റെ കൊട്ടാരമാണെങ്കിൽ ആ രാജാവിന്റെ കൊട്ടാരം, പിന്നെ കാടാണെങ്കിൽ കാടിന്റെ അവസ്ഥ, അങ്ങനെ ഓരോ സെറ്റുകൾ അതായത് കാർപ്പാലെന്ന ചെന്തമിഴിലുള്ള പാട്ടുകളും അതിനോടൊപ്പം വരുന്ന ചുവടുകളും അതൊരു കഥയായിട്ടാണ് ഞങ്ങൾ ഇവിടെ അവതരിപ്പിക്കുന്നത്. പിന്നെ തമിഴ്നാട് പണ്ഡിതനായ ചിന്നത്തമ്പ്യാനായാണ് ഫസ്റ്റ് നാടകം രചിക്കുന്നത്. കർമാന്റെ രചന ചിന്നത്തമ്പ്യാനാണ്. പിന്നിപ്പോൾ ഒരുപാട് നാടകങ്ങൾ മലയാള രൂപത്തിൽ, അന്നത്തെ ഭാഷ തമിഴായിരുന്നതിന്റെ പേരിൽ തമിഴിലാണ് ഫസ്റ്റ് നാടകം രചിക്കപ്പെട്ടത്. അതായത് ഈ നാടകം ഇപ്പോൾ നമ്മൾ അവതരിപ്പിക്കുന്ന ആ ഭാഷയിൽ തന്നെയാണ്. ചെന്തമിഴാണ് ഇതിന്റെ ഭാഷ.
That's enough, Yaya. Could we stop the clip? That's fine. I think that's quite fine for the moment. Thanks. Lovely. So everybody, that was, we'll talk about the clip in a second, but let me first introduce us to you. We, Ari and I, are an English and Bangla speaking academic and literary critic, and a French and Tamil speaking writer of historical fiction. Since May the 20th, 2020, so just under a year now, we are collaborating officially as co-founders of the cultural platform Latinai Creole. Shared interests in memory, multilingual mess, and creolization draw us together. Creolization for us unfolds historical process, cultural theory, and resistance. It is the genesis of diverse cultural products through the unexpected encounter of different people in compacted spaces under unequal power dynamics. Negotiation, compromise, collaboration, innovation, and improvisation all characterizes the processes of exchange that ensue. In South Asia, exclusionist discourses of caste and religious purity have become normalized. Power is concentrated in the English language, in classical Indic languages like Sanskrit or even Tamil, and ethno-linguistic silos inherited from colonial classifications. Creolized cultural expressions are pushed to the margins of the public sphere, or sometimes trotted out as folklore or showcased, as you saw in the clip that we started with. Our quest is to taste, hear, move with, and touch Creole again through activating memories of what we see as a creolized Indic habitus. As writer and critic, we understand the symbiotic relationship between form and content. Hence, we express ourselves in a particular way. We don't just talk about the fugitive, the disappearing, the fragmented, and the forgotten. We want to express ourselves in ways that embody those forms. So our praxis assumes the public intimacy of conversations broadcast live on our platform, Latinai Creole, which are replete with laughter, pauses, interruptions, and cacophony. We use conversation as method to enlace speculation, which is the domain of the fiction writer, with analysis, the tool of the scholar, and of course, our personal memories of the India that we know.
Bon samedi, amara le bateau et se détendait les muscles. Il croyait être en avance sur son rendez-vous, mais fut surpris de voir Sanglé Kalpo déjà sur la rive. Ce dernier fumait tranquillement son surtout. Qui j'en liais? Va-moi la main, frère. Moins. Les deux hommes se serrèrent fort dans les bras. Elle est où l'autre? Elle est arrivée bien avant nous et déjà dans le Kucini. Lorsque les deux amis s'approchèrent du cimetière hollandais, Ari Gautier finissait de préparer son fameux poutou. On était la veille du Nouvel An, et comme toutes les années, les trois amis se réunissaient pour se retrouver à Kucini pour rendre hommage au Kabir et faire la fête avec leur vieux compagnon Kabir. la fête battait son plein. Rassasiés par le poteau et le poisson vindai, les fêtards buvaient et fumaient joyeusement. Il n'y a plus de rhum, bon samedi. Kapeli Mutapaf parut déçu. Non, mais il me reste encore du kallu, si tu veux. Sanglé Kalpo lui tendit la bouteille. Ah non, ne me kakkus pas avec ton kallu, toi. J'ai mieux que ça. Goûte ce nectar, Kapeli Mutapen, dit Nyairodo Kedul. C'est quoi? Demanda évidemment Baron Samedi. Ça, c'est du rat punch, fait à partir du meilleur arak au monde, le Batavia Arak. Minuit, un immense brasier monta vers le ciel du cimetière hollandais près du fort Kochi. Tandis que les amis dansaient autour du feu, Papanji brûlait pour garder la mémoire impérissable de l'histoire.
Baron Samdi moored his boat and stretched. He thought he was early, but actually he wasn't, and he was surprised to see Sangli Kalpu already there on the shore. The latter was quietly smoking his surutu, his cigar. How are you? Hey, give me your hand, brother. The two men hugged each other tightly. Where's the third? She arrived long before you, and she's already in the Kucini. When the two friends approached the Dutch cemetery, Nyairodo Kidul was preparing her famous puttu. It was New Year's Eve, and like every year, the three friends gathered to meet in Kochi to pay homage to the Kapiris and to party with their old companion, Kapiri Muthapan. The party was in full swing. Satiated by the puttu and the fish vindai, the revelers happily drank and smoked. Is there no more rum, Baron Samdi? Kapiri Muthapan looked disappointed. No, but I still have some kallu if you want it. Sangli Kalpu handed him a bottle. Oh no, don't kakkus me with your kallu, you, said Nyai Roro Kadal. I have better than that. Taste this nectar. She handed it to the others. What's this? Baron Samadi asked eagerly. This is rack punch made from the best arak in the world, Batavia arak. It was midnight. A huge blaze rose up to the sky from the Dutch cemetery near Fort Kochi. While the friends danced around the fire, the effigy of Papanchi burned to preserve the lasting memory of history. So this was my translation of the little scene that you imagined, Ari, for us, to illustrate how the words we used for the title of our presentation, Kucini, kallu, and kakkus, can enter an ordinary dialogue or conversation today, whether that's French or whether that's Tamil or some language in between. These words were chosen carefully by us as lexical clues to what we identify as a Creole Indic habitus. Kucini, for example, is from Portuguese cozinha, kitchen, and it is used in Tamil and a number of other South Indian languages to mean kitchen. Kakkus, of course, is from the Dutch kakhuis, and it is used also again in a number of South Indian languages, including Tamil, to indicate the bathroom, the toilet. And kallu, of course, is a Tamil word for palm wine toddy. And we included it there because we wanted to kind of show the level of vernacular taste making that the words of Portuguese and Dutch origin entered. Such words in these clusters illustrate the fundamental transformation of lifeways in the Indic world triggered by the encounter between local people and different kinds of Europeans, a historical phase that was inaugurated, of course, by Vasco da Gama's disembarkation near Calicut in 1498. And the scenario that you created for us is, of course, in Kochi, which is part of the same Malabar coast. Now, in Kochi, like many, many other places up and down the coasts of India, the Portuguese and then the Dutch, the French, the Danes, the British, all of these European powers founded a number of coastal enclaves, which became hubs of cultural exchange. And these were typically, again, signaled through forts, settlements of different kinds, and so on. Their economic potential attracted, of course, many kinds of people, including merchant communities from outside and inside India. Creolisation, as we know it, as we understand it, resulted. New unexpected cultural products sprang up from this interaction between different languages, different foodways, different ways of living, and of course, different gods.
You see, first of all, writing about gods is very fun because gods are fun. They've always been fun before we make them serious. We made them so serious We made them confined, we made them nationalistic,
Mm-hmm.
we confined them into religion. But before that, for a long time, in any mythology, gods used to travel from one culture to another, and they borrowed from one power to another. And even if you take our Indic space, the Aryan gods borrowed from the Dravidian gods, and they became something else different. You go to the Scandinavian mythology, is the same thing, and any European thing. So I go back to the tradition in Africa and also in the Dravidian culture, where we mock the gods. We treat them like anyone, like our friends. So this is why I bring them the Sangilikarpan. Sangilikarpan is a Dravidian deity, village deity. When he travels all the way, when he crosses the ocean and goes to Reunio, he becomes Sangilikalpu.
Because it's creolized. The word is the name is creolized.
Name is creolized. Baonsandi is the same thing. Is a Nigerian god who goes to Haiti and becomes Pepe Papa Gaude or Baron Samdi and whatever. And Kapiri Muttapan, will come back to Kapiri Muttapan. We have a fascinating story behind it because it starts from the African coast, ended up in Kochi. And of course, the last one is the goddess of ocean from Indonesia, who brings this Batavia Arak, which is fascinating. Where this Batavia, because we know the Caribbean rum and we know the Tamil kallu, but this Batavia Arak is another fascinating story. Because when the Portuguese came, and of course they came to India for spices, and they found out easily that there are other spices in Malacca. So they went all the way down to Malacca. So the Dutch came later on, and they settled down in Java, and found out that the local people, they were drinking some kind of arak, because arak is the Arabic word of distilled spirit, which in the old Indic space. So when they come there and they see this, the people, the local people drinking arak, but made out of rice, which is a Chinese technique, because the fermentation or the distillation of rice is difficult than fermentation of fruits.
Mm-hmm.
So the Chinese from Fuji, they used to have a technique to use palm wine. Then again, you see the process of creolisation. They come with the technique of rice, and they end up in Java because they know that even though there's rice, but the local custom is to drink palm wine.
Mm-hmm.
So they use a technique to make this arak out of palm wine. So when the Dutch comes, they say, okay, oh, this is interesting. These guys are having something interesting. So they make, they take this arak out of, make the fruit, they take it to Netherlands, they age there, they bottle, and they age the bottle, and of course they sell it there under the name of Batavia Arak, which is the finest arak in the world. And then out of that, what they do, they make the punch, which is very Caribbean, which is from the Indic space, which is punch, which is the 5 elements. And then it becomes the Batavia Arak punch, the rat punch. So this is how the creolization happens with the gods. And that is how I bring Sangalikalpu, Baron Samdi, and Kapri Muttapan to celebrate and drinking and smoking surutu and dancing. And Papanchi is the last figure. Papanchi means grandfather in Portuguese.
Yes.
Right? Or that's what people believe.
That's what people believe. When you actually look at the Portuguese, lexical, the philology, there isn't really a way of saying that Papanchi, the word comes from Portuguese, but he is assumed to be Portuguese, and it's an effigy that's dressed as a European. And that's the most important thing for us, this idea that a European effigy, a European man in the silhouette of top hat and suit, every New Year's Eve is burnt ceremoniously in front of Fort Kochi, which of course was exactly this place where the power changed. The Dutch took Cochin from the Portuguese in the 17th century. And the idea of, I love the way you end the scenario when you say that Papanchi is burning to preserve the memory of history. because this is really where we are entering with our work on imagining, activating memories of creolization. There are several steps here in this process of activation, and we're going to talk about it as we go along. But what I want to say is, for us, one of the major steps is that we use what I call a scenario as method. So we've evolved this method, haven't we, Ari, over the past year of working together, because you are a writer and I am an analyst. So, you know, we want to, rather than force you to like adopt my technique and me to adopt yours, we have just, you know, brought it together in a way that hopefully, as I said in the beginning, enlaces, you know, speculation with analysis. So scenarios like the ones you have created, in which involve elements from the study we do together, and also what we know from the life worlds we have lived, I think these scenarios are kind of important because creolization itself worldwide, and that's the research that I've done, it shows me, but it is best remembered through performance, not through words, not through historiography in written texts, but through performance itself. And we started our talk with the Chautunatakam, which is from the Malabar coast. It's a performative genre, which basically is they call it the stamping dance, a very vigorous theatrical tradition, which tells the stories of the chanson de geste of medieval Europe. Charlemagne, Roland, you know, these characters, how did they land up on the Malabar coast? Well, because obviously they were the part and parcel of the toolkit of conversion techniques brought by the missionaries, such as the Jesuits, to convert the people they found. And these stories were a dramatic, effective way of bringing people into the fold. But what is interesting to me is that we shouldn't see them today as some kind of an epiphenomenon of creolization, but they are the phenomenon itself. Because when we read the genre of a Chautunatakam as creolized, we are not just analyzing the surface level of meaning making, because that is itself very attractive. For example, the costumes, they're crazy. You know, I mean, Ari, the material that we read in the past couple of days, there was that article from 1932, which indicates that, so there was this a European couple that found themselves folklorists, Dutch folklorists, actually, I think, okay, found themselves on the Malabar coast, and they were told this is an interesting genre, come and have a look. And those people said, for our costumes, we need stockings. Our characters must wear European stockings, and we are running out of them. So Mrs. Bake had to give her stockings to them, you know. So this is the interesting way in which bits and pieces of an imagined past are reassembled. So the costumes themselves could take an entire PhD dissertation to work out. Dance movements, the gestures, the language of the songs. But more than all that, it's the performance itself, all told, which the Germans call Gesamtkunstwerk, you know, the entire artwork. It transmits the memory of creolization. I don't think it's any accident or any coincidence that of all the chanson de geste stories, all the cycle elements that could go into the Chautunatakam, it's the Charlemagne stories that are the most popular still. Exactly. And it's Karlsman in, you know, the local people, that's how they creolize the name, Karlsman and Roldon, who is Roland, sorry. So Roland and Charlemagne, of course, are involved in all these stories about defeating the Saracens, the Turks. So this Moors and Christians, which is this very stable performative genre, again, across the creolized world, in the Caribbean and so on, reappears in the Malabar coast, because that idea of conversion is itself the story of creolization. So that's what I mean, but it's not really an epiphenomenon, but the phenomenon. And similarly, we have seen other, we have many other performance genres that we have noted, which is really what Diana Taylor has called the repertoire. It's not the archive, it's a repertoire that really records key moments in creolization processes, and therefore calls for an epistemology that flouts the boundaries. That was why it was prescient that that's how Francio introduced you, because really this epistemology must flout the boundaries between myths, history, fiction, reality, and so on. And so the scenarios that you are creating for us in our work, like the one you just showed, spoke to, read out to us, through these scenarios, really, we kind of retrieve, showcase, and also set up a scene for analyzing the dynamics of Creole Indias, including acknowledging that which is no more, because not everything always remains, you know, and Papanchis, papanchi, the effigy that burns, is, I think, a good example of a symbolic acknowledgement of that too.
Yeah. And, it's interesting because you talk about the Kapiri Mutapan and Kapiri tradition also in the Cochin fort, because we need to understand that it's a tragic story, but at the same time, it's nice how they change the course of narration and what's happening later to the Kapiris. Because the Portuguese, when they come to the Malabar coast in 1498, they capture African slaves from the west coast, or already from Capo Verde, and then they come from the Mozambique coast, and then they capture the slaves. They bring them to Kucini. So from Cochin, these African slaves for till 18th century, there was thousands of slaves who were being brought to India. So they've been working there. They've been part of the army. They were militaries. They were builders. So they lived there. So in 1658, when the Dutch, they leave Batavia to come to Cochin, of course, the Portuguese power was totally declining at the time. So it was easy to defeat them. So Dutch take over Cochin, and they give 3 days to Portuguese. Okay, you guys have to leave this place. So within 3 days, the Portuguese don't know what to do. Of course, there was the Portuguese and there was the mestizos, which were there. So these people fled by leaving back the Africans and all the wealth they amassed over 2-3 centuries. But before going, what they did, they put all these African slaves into a wall and they walled them up. And that's the end. And people think or believe that the African slaves were walled up in order to guard all the wealth, which was the treasure which was there. So, and then what happens later on in Cochin, people started to worship these kapiris. Kapiris in Indian language is kafris, kaf, from the Arabic word kafr. So the kapiri, and then they started to worship the wall and the kapiri spirits. And the kapiri spirits come under one person, which is Kapiri Mutapan. So Kapiri Mutapan has another very vague personality. Sometimes is an African god or spirit. Sometimes is a South Indian Dravidian spirit. Sometimes is a Dutch or Portuguese or European spirit. He's wearing like suit and everything. So we don't know exactly what he is. We don't know Kapiri Mutapan is a white or black or Dravidian. So this is very fascinating how the Kapiri Mutapan myth is still existing. And the one way of pleasing Kapiri Mutapan is by giving the putu. Putu, which is again a Creole product, which is very difficult to understand because we can trace them. Our research in the Kucini Tales that is coming up tomorrow, I think, because we are doing a series of article on an Indian newspaper, which is called Kucini Tales. We are explaining the creolization of different food items in the Indic space. So our research shows that putu is a product of the same creolizing maritime culture as the Kapiri Mutapan. While Kapiri Mutapan emerges from the Western Indian Ocean, linking East Africa and the Malabar coast, putu comes from the Malabar coast from the Eastern Indian Ocean. There are similar dishes called by similar names in the Philippines, Indonesia, and Malacca. But we are less interested in origins and more interested in the roots through which culture moves and transforms. The technique of steaming rice flour shapes Italy's putu, arrived on Indian coastline and was adapted to Indians' non-sticky rice flours. European trade intensified the circulation and steamed items around the Indian Ocean world. So see how complicated and interesting it gets.
Well, I mean, this is the interesting thing that when we see this composite, so people have studied Kapiri Mutapan before. Kapiri Mutapan, because it's a very, interesting, again, trace of African presence on the western coast of India. The African slaves, which were believed to have become walled up are now emerging in this form of a spirit which has to be appeased, like Indic gods with certain foods, and here this food item called puttu, which is so associated and supposed to be this original Kerala, very authentic Kerala item of the Malabar coast. Well, why is this food offered to this spirit is the question we had, because people have studied the persistence of the Kapari Muthappan myth or this idea that there is such a spirit. People have very correctly analyzed that as a sort of cultural memory of a buried, submerged, and disguised cultural memory of African presence on the Malabar coast. But our question is, but why puttu? So as we see, because puttu itself, if you analyze it, emerges to be a very creolized food that is coming from Southeast Asia onto the same Malabar coast, we see this convergence of a creolized food and a creolized god as a kind of, this is what we understand as creolizing through the oceans. So the Indic space becomes a hinge to look at, to almost mythopoetically, crystallize these transoceanic transformations. But this, what is very interesting also is that the dish, puttu, different people in local groups in Fort Kochi offer Kapari Muthappan this dish then, I feel, as a community's disguised memory of a vibrant creolized past created through the presence of many different kinds of people in Fort Kochi. But that past has been walled up, just as Kapari Muthappan has been walled up. And this bringing this food to the god, to the spirit, acknowledges symbolically that we often wall up facts because of fears of impurity, particularly in South Asia. And different communities bringing different foods to Kapari Muthappan, therefore, in a way, ask him for appeasement. And it's very interesting that because puttu is a cake made of rice flour, which is steamed, but it's made with this non-glutinous rice flour of South Asia. And so it's very fragile and it can crumble. And so if it's not made well. So the myth is that if you don't give the first portion of puttu to Kapari Muthappan, the entire puttu will fall apart. And so I read this as, again, a symbolic acknowledgement that a Creole spirit needs to be appeased through Creole food to keep history and identity porous, but not falling apart. So that's the symbolic, balance created by this myth. But this kind of complex relationship with creolized pasts that crystallized in India's enclaves, but decreolized because of pressures of the present. I think we can see this also in your own home space, Pondicherry, Ari, and maybe it would be interesting for us to hear a little bit about it now. This, after all, Pondicherry was the starting point of how our collaboration started, because I was interested in Pondicherry and you were there to tell me about it. So tell us a little bit about how creolization, as we understand it, has shaped Pondicherry.
Well, that's why, because Yaya asked me, I'm the most chilling guy sitting on a bench, and this is my tinai. So this is exactly what the tinai is about, is a place where you can just relax. So when I talk to whoever in any kind of conference, I make sure that I create that space of the tinai at home, because that's where I feel the most comfortable to talk about the Pondicherry and the tinai. So the tinai, as part of my book, is a space exactly where different communities and languages converged. You see, it is not the typical South Indian Tamil tinai where there was only meant to one category of people or one caste. So that's what happens normally, even though the tinai is considered as open space to welcome all kind of people. But I made sure by my writing that the tinai becomes creolized, because Gilbert Tata comes from Guadeloupe. He is a mix himself from Indian and a French guy. Then we have this the maid Lourdes herself is another Creole character from the Creole community from Pondicherry. And the Creole community from Pondicherry is very interesting because, first of all, we need to know that we need to stop seeing Pondicherry as only a French enclave or French comptoir or colony. So of course there was English for there, but Right before there were Dutch, there were Danes, there were Portuguese, but all these memories got erased. Then the French made sure that it remains only French. And you see, if you see just the urban plan, the city plan, it was a Dutch drawn plan. It was not French. See, in 1693, when the Dutch took over, and the city was in a mess. And 1694, if you see the map from 1694, 1 year after the Dutch took over, you can see the actual plan which is existing now. And till 2004, till Jean Deloche, a local historian but French guy, nobody knew that it was a Dutch map. Of course, maybe among the academics and researcher and historians, but for the public outside, it was not known as a Dutch map. People thought it was a French map. So Jean Deloche divulged that it was a Dutch map. And then we have also this fantastic Atelier de Surdécor, which I think it's on, in 1610, actually, the Dutch already started to import porcelain, or you say China, from Japan to the Coromandel coast, and using Chinese technique, Chinese artisans. Mm-hmm. So already you can see, and then when they brought it to Pondicherry, the Pondicherry artisan, they made the surdécor. I don't know how you call it in English.
Overglaze.
Overglaze, okay, overglaze. So overglaze and send it to the European market, like in France, in different part of France. So it's interesting to see how this the creolization of the society has been erased and just keep it as like very French or British monopole over Pondicherry. So that's another reason why I created the character Lourdes to bring down these memories of Portuguese, Dutch, Danes, and whoever was there. And with that, and of course, but later on we can speak about the language, the food, and different aspect of creolization of Pondicherry.
Well, I think we can, because I'm seeing the time, once we start talking, we can go on. But
we don't realize the time, right?
Well, we could, but, I have my teaching coming up later in the afternoon, so I'll keep an eye on that. But what I want to say is this, that through this figure of Lourdes that you make quite central in your novel, The Thin Eye, so the thin eye, of course, is a space where people are sitting and exchanging stories, and it's this threshold, liminal space in between the interior of the house and the exterior of the house. And you told us how you've creolized it anyway and made it a Pondicherry thin eye. But one of the ways in which you do so is by introducing this Creole character. So of course, Pondicherry is a creolized and creolizing space, but like in many of these spaces, you actually have a community called the Creoles. And you have, in fact, two. You've got the high Creoles who are claiming to be white and they're very shishi, and you've got the low Creoles, the bar Creoles, like the character Lourdes, who are actually the product of a very kind of initial process of métissage, we can call it, mixing, but between the Portuguese and Indo-Portuguese people already circulating around the Deccan and locals. The fact is that they were Christian, so that gave them a certain entry or a possibility of entry into this Old Creole space as well. But the main thing about the figure of Lourdes is through her, you introduce into your novel the entire sensorium of that Creole world, which is because creolization is often considered within even creolized societies, with as value judgments are brought upon creolized cultural products. That's the problem. So she smuggles into your novel, all those things that people do in the food they cook, the language, the particularities of language, the music, the dance, and she becomes your kind of switch, to show through people like her, through that culture, other communities like your own community of Franco-Tamils by affiliation are also getting creolized. So I think this is very important, how you kind of give us a sort of mechanism in your novel for how communities become creolized in Pondicherry and other places, other enclaves like Pondicherry. It's not just a matter of métissage or biological, mixing that is there, but then that also generates possibilities of affiliation. And to be honest, I see exactly very similar things going on in the part of the country that I'm from, which is Bengal. In particular, it's very compressed space called the Hooghly district, where you had, from the 16th century onwards, the Portuguese, the Danish, the Dutch, and the British, and of course the French, all having their little settlements, cheek by jowl, in this small space. Today, in a rickshaw, you can go from one to the other just in 10 minutes, you'll arrive from one to the other, And all these spaces are, again, very fertile creolizing hotspots because of the way they compress different kinds of people together. And this is our way of really clarifying Indic creolization. It is no binary between, I don't know, locals and the French, and then A plus B gives C. It is a swirled and very multinodal affair with all these European powers and others, non-Europeans, Armenians, the Chinese, all of these mercantile and colonizing kind of trajectories are swirling together in these spaces and leaving a very densely compacted, possibility of cultural generation. And one thing that we find very interesting, and that's why we go back to the Kapiri Mutappan and the Puttu story, which we see parallels in, say, Bengal as well, food items that our popular memory associates with the entry of the Europeans into the space, or the entry of various kinds of external influences. In the space of Bengal, it is the very fact of curdling milk to create milk-based sweets, which are considered extremely Bengali, but everybody in popular memory in Bengal knows or says, just like Papanji is supposed to be Portuguese, these sweets were introduced, the technique was introduced by the Portuguese. But very interestingly, these sweets, which are therefore both extremely Bengali and quite creolized, even in the popular imagination, are associated through certain performance genres with figures that are also creolized in the popular memory. And one such figure is the famous Antony Firingi, Antony the Foreigner, who was, by the 19th century, was, he emerges in popular imagination as a singer of certain dialogic genres, also about conversion and which religion is best and which culture is best. And this kind of dialogic song and song competition, Antony conducts with his most famous sparring partner is somebody who makes sweets, the same sweets that we are talking about. So, food and performance and dialogue and debate about these very cultural events that are creating the creolized culture are, always meshed. And here it should be noted that Antony Firingi is imagined to be of Portuguese heritage, but his name is supposedly remembered again as Antony Hensman, which sounds far more Germanic and therefore links us to the Dutch and the Danish population of the Hooghly rather than the Portuguese. And the songs taunt Antony for praying in church, the Danish church, even though he's supposed to be Portuguese, wearing boots and top hat and coat, which is, of course, the words are from English. But Antony replies in the songs that, no, he's Bengali by now. And, Bengal is for everybody, including people like him. So these kinds of memorializations that these performative genres encode, whether it's in Bengal or whether it's the Malabar coast, and I'm sure we would have examples from the Coromandel coast where Pondicherry is, I think they are activated by contemporary forms. And that's what's interesting for us. I see your own novel as a form of activation, to be honest, of these memories. But I think here, what's interesting to me, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about this, going back to the Chavitu Natakam, with which we started, there is this local insistence that there's somebody called Chinnathambi Anavi, who who created some of the Charlemagne songs, right? Like he wrote the texts.
Yeah.
And the language also, there's something confusing about the language. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, Chinnathambi Anavi, I don't know. To be honest, I have done a lot of research around that guy. It's very difficult to find out who that guy is. But there is couple of statues in the Malabar coast about Chinnathambi Anavi. But Chinnathambi, obviously, it's a Tamil name, which means small brother. Anavi, we don't know what Anavi means. But when you dig a little deeper, you understand that Chinnathambi Anavi is not really an Indian and is not a Firangi either. So, it's very vague. So it's like all these Firangis like Anthony. So when the Europeans enter the Indic space, suddenly they lose all their Europeanness. And they don't really become totally Indian because they can't become totally Indian either. But they travel between these two, and they create their own creolisation on their own by taking elements from, like, for example, Charlemagne and Roland, and then writing lyrics in Tamil and performing in Malabar Coast where they don't speak anymore Tamil. They speak Malayalam because Malayalam has become the official language of Malabar Coast. So it's quite of interesting how this Chinnathambi Anavi has created his own genre of theater performance with different elements.
Yeah.
And the Firangis themselves, they are very interesting character, which which we need to think very more about these people.
I know that we have to wrap up because I've just seen a message from Francio. Actually, Francio, I want to just bring it all together by saying that what are we doing with retrieving all these ambivalent go-between figures who are being again ritually appeased with certain kinds of Creole foods and which and around them crystallize certain performative genres, which all of this we are calling the creolized habitus of the Indic space. Well, the point is that there is what we should note is that creolization in the Indic space is also deeply involved with different kinds of marginalizations, particularly those of caste. All these groups we are talking about represent one way or the other caste marginalizations. And so when we retrieve and reactivate these stories, we are also performing, we are reusing creolization as in other parts of the world, but in this specific case, as resistance. And the way we do it is through, of course, our platform, the Thin Eye Creole, where we broadcast these stories, we talk about them, we invite others to participate in the discussions. And in this way, I think we are trying to break down the very walls that imprison Kapri Mutapan, the African spirit who was walled up. We try to remind people that the coastlines of the Indic world are porous. And we want to celebrate that porosity by making sure that creolization continues to be mobilized by us as resistance. So when we do our next event for the Atelier on the 7th of May, we will actually do a Thin Eye Creole event. So people will see how that works out. But in the meanwhile, thank you very much, everybody, for listening to us again. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
You're welcome. Thank both of you for this wonderful dialogue which took place between the two of you. For lack of time, I will pass it on to Wayne Modest, and then I'll open it up to the audience. Perfect. Wayne, I already introduced you, so you can do your stuff immediately. Where are you? Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. All right, thank you, Francio, for inviting me, KITLV and the Atelier. Thanks, good to see you, Ananya. It's been a while, but wonderful. And Ari, I think we saw each other not so long ago, so in another situation.
Yeah.
It is extremely hard, and you put me in a very funny position. And had it not been you both, and had it not been Francio, I would not have said yes, because now I feel, oh, what have I got myself into? So what I'm going to try and do is just in a few minutes speak to some of the issues, the questions that animated my interest as you were presenting, and some of the challenges that I think are attendant to what you're trying to do. First of all, though, there are certain things, certain gems that I want to highlight, theoretical gems that I want to highlight that I think could demand much more attention. In a way, your praise for the question of ambivalence and what does it mean to think ambivalence as a concept, as a theoretical space, but as a space in which we inhabit. So that's one thing that I wanted to hold on to. The second one, which I found really fascinating, is the question of conversion and the importance of thinking about conversion and how conversion helps us. And from my own perspective within a sort of heritage studies, and because I think through the question of religion and religious materiality, it is also interested from our perspective in my kind of museum to think from how objects become, for example, converted from one belonging through missionaries to another belonging, and then they get converted back to, for example, to their ritual forms. And so within these discussions of the restitution of objects that animate my own world, that is a question that what animates our interest. What happens when these things convert? Another thing that I found wonderful when Ari spoke, when he says we are less interested in origins, we are more interested in roots, to really think again about what an attention not to stasis but to mobility looks like. And so one of the questions that I want to ask you at the end is your work also a work to try and think through what a theory of mobility could look like? Not a theory of stasis, but what a theory of mobility could look like. And how do your conceptual arguments help us to move away from our investment in stasis as a part of our mode of description? Because I think that one of the struggles we have theoretically very often, conceptually, is that we don't know how to theorize things on the move. We need things to stop to talk about them. So I wanted to bring some attention in this. All of what you've said, though, emerges from me from another perspective. I am from the Caribbean. I think from and with the Caribbean. I think about the Caribbean. So it raised a lot of familiar conversations as you started to speak. For example, the work of somebody like Edward Kamau Brathwaite and Kamau's Brathwaite's own investment in the question of creolization. It raised also a question for me, and this was beautiful when you spoke about myth and history. Questions for me for a wonderful thought about scholar Wilson Harris from Guyana, and Wilson Harris's investment in the question of thinking about history as myth and fable, which ties also to the work of somebody like Derek Walcott, who is also trying to think about these similar questions. But it also places me in a troubling position with your own work to ask you a second question that is troubling for me. Because if we were to take Edward Glissant as the starting point, I might want to ask you, why an investment in Creole and not an investment in creolization? And what is the relationship between the Creole and the ization, which is the investment both of, I would say, a Glissant, as well as somebody like Brathwaite, who for them, the idea of this processual is something that was more important than attending to the Creole itself. So I'm interested in that relationship between that Creole and your investment in Creole and the ization as a process of ongoing becoming, which is what we would speak of when we speak to Glissant. And therefore, my question would be, what is your relationship between creolization, and Glissant's notion of us being in relations? In relations.
Yeah.
All right. So, and then after that, Francio, I know that you all didn't give me here the chance to speak because you wanted to hear me. And so I will close by asking my most troubling question,
Oops.
which is, what then, Ananya and Ari, and which is what you were saying at the end, is the analytical yield for me, who works from the Caribbean, to return to a 1970s discussion, one could say, around Creole. What is the analytical yield that can give us today? Because you could ask yourself the question, how does Creole and creolization, what is its politics? Because sometimes especially when we speak about Creole food and Creole this and Creole that, including names. It is actually an anti-politics. It is actually, especially in Europe, especially when food comes into into play, it is actually a staging of the spectacularity of others instead of, so let us go outside and we all eat Creole food because it all makes us a kind of nice, this is how we created. Where does that politics now sit in the politics of the present, which is one that is inhabited by multiple precarity around certain bodies that were formerly colonized? So that is what is the politics then of Creole. And I will stop there by also saying that if there's anything else you've done today when you went back to the question of the archive and the repertoire, is one of the things that I think you've also challenged us to do, is to probably think not only in terms of critique, because we are good at criticism. That's what we are good at. I know how to do it so well that sometimes I wonder. What we are not good enough at sometimes is creativity and imagination. And what you've suggested in your work is a question about what does critique do, criticality do, for us to imagine other possible possibles, other possible futures. And I'll stop there.
Thanks very much. Ari, shall I go with a few of Wayne's?
You do that because, you know, this is not my field.
That's very convenient. You're going to have to address the possible possibilities. I'll leave that to you. Don't worry. But let me try to grasp some of the many important things that Wayne said. But Wayne, I'm not going to go through them linearly. I'm kind of approaching them globally as the central messages coming out of all the different things you said. And if we want to talk about some things which I've missed out, obviously you will
yes,
again.
Certainly.
So it's a conversation. I mean, first of all, I think we are actually, ironically, we are very invested in creolization. Creolization is definitely the processuality of creolization, decreolization, recreolization. All that is absolutely in there for us. We are very far from actually celebrating some static notion of a Creole identity, because first of all, the word Creole just by itself, if we had to want to apply it even just descriptively to situations in India, for example, language, a linguist will tell you, where are the Creole languages of India? So it's quite difficult. I mean, we know that the word Creole is used descriptively in, self-ascriptively by a number of communities all over the world and for a number of the cultural productions. So the word Creole, if I have attached it, for example, we use it for Thin Night Creole, our platform, or I use it for my project, Creole Indias. It's more poetic. It's more provocative because India is never thought of as Creole. So we want to shatter that because we want to actually open up the stasis and those obsessions with purity that reject the notion of the word Creole from a vocabulary that is Indic, whether that is in the Indian peninsular space, where it's totally like not even understood as a possibility, or whether it's out there in Indian diasporic spaces where it becomes a political contentious issue, who wants to be called Creole, who wants to be called Creolized, and so on. So this then is our interest in joining the dots, bringing up the small traces of Creole communities, such as the Bar Creole community that Ari himself talks about or makes his character come from in his novel. So it's not that there are no communities to which this word attached, they're very tiny. So we are using them merely, as Ari has done in the novel, as a kind of touchstone to then draw out the processes of affiliation and cultural contamination used totally in a legit way by me, whereby creolization occurs. So that's the way. So our job really is, through this mixture of fictive play with possibilities, what could have happened, might have happened, hasn't happened, happened but is hidden. We want to open up those lines of actually creolization, and sometimes the dots that are joining up are dots that call themselves Creole. Do you see what I'm saying? And other times those words are not used. So that's the relationship between Creole and creolization for us. Very happy that you saw so many dialogic possibilities with big Caribbean thinkers, because of course for me, academically, I came to Creole Indias through my journeys in the Caribbean and the Atlantic world. I wasn't thinking about Creole Indias before I did my big project on Afro-diasporic dance and music, which then made me think about creolization as an important term for myself. And that's how I went back to India. So, it's that journey and my teaching as a professor of English literature of the greats, Walcott, Wilson Harris, and so on. I mean, that essay by Wilson Harris on the limbo.
Yeah. Oh.
That is the iconic essay on creolization, on creation of culture through recourse to myth and fable. So we need our writers. So I'm very lucky because in my perambulations through life, I stumbled across an author such as Ari, who actually is thinking along such similar lines as me, but he is using fiction. So this enables me as an academic to really break out of some shackles, of what is allowed, what is permitted, what is permissible, what are the methods that I thought I was quite intrepid as an academic, but only after I met Ari, I really, so let's just go for it. If we want to talk about Baron Samdi, want to talk about a kakkus, let's do it, it's fine. We are using the material of the everyday life. But I know that Ari in his own life journeys has had inspiration from the Caribbean, has had inspiration from Africa, from West Africa, where he even lived for a few, from Indonesia, where he lived. So, we have very similar kind of approaches to these other worlds, which are very often understood as creolized more easily than the Indic space. And that's what enables us to come back to our space and pay attention to the politics of using such a term, but in a very deliberate way, so that we can shake things up and make people think differently, particularly about issues of purity and impurity, which always come in the way when we want to think about inclusion, when we want to think about social justice, when we want to think about economic justice. That's the problems in our Indic space. So we see creolization as enabling us to it's like a lever, that helps us open things up.
Thank you, Ananya. Is it possible for us to open it up? Because I think there are other persons who might have
Let's do that. Yeah.
Questions, so you can take all of
Ari,
that.
I hope I represented you okay.
No, you're doing fine. I'm good.
Okay.
Good.
I like to chill out. I'm the chill god.
Yeah. Questions? There's a question from Marika, I see. Marika, please.
Hi, yeah, thanks for, this was really fascinating. I'd like to link up with the last item. I was listening to how you use the word Indic, and also wondering why you choose the Creole habitus. I understand, and I understand that you look at a space that is called Indic, but that is also a political concept and has its own problems. So my question is, I think, what is the Indic, and why did you decide to use that as a recurring concept?
It would be quite interesting to hear from you, Marika, perhaps a little bit more about what you consider are the political problems around the word, so that I know where you're coming from.
Yeah, well, I'm working on a project on Indonesia and the idea of Greater India, and the phenomenon that Indonesia as a the predominantly Islamic country is always represented as a Hindu Buddhist in popular culture and in museums and in the Greater India societies.
No, that's helpful. That clarifies a little bit where your root of questioning this issue. Again, Ari, would you like to? Well, I think, again, we are in agreement on this issue. We gravitated towards this word. I mean, okay, what were the other alternatives? You could use Indian.
Yeah.
That I think is worse than Indic, if you ask me, because it's totally associated with the nation state, right? We could use South Asia. I don't like it in this context because, again, it's too geopolitical, and its nuances are again, where does South Asia begin and end? Also, it flattens matters out a bit. Some of the things we are talking, some of the affective worlds we are talking about are very, very deep rooted, and they go back to long before South Asia as a term emerges geopolitically, or the area it indicates. So Indic, not Indian, for us does a certain nuanced work, you know, and I think it helps us because, for example, on the Tinai Creole, Ari and I have invited Pakistani authors and you know, cultural producers to come on board, and they they understand that term and they come on board. We talk about, we had this amazing event last in December, which we called Creole Indicas, where we talked about the Gandhar civilization. You know, we talked about the maritime civilizations taking those vectors of culture to the spaces you're working on, Marika, but in the you know, pre-colonial past. And so we all understood what we meant by that word. It was trying to evade these, you know, I mean, any word is problematic for sure, because it will. So in this context that you are looking at, I think I understand why such a word would have some horror of, again, and this idea of a greater India, which is also a very Hindu nationalist project, you know, but we are trying to use Indic slightly differently to evoke certain, you know, yes, deep-seated affective kind of, you know, almost like nodes, you know, that go to really take us to pre-colonial periods as well, because we don't want to say that everything, of course, only started with the colonial advent in India. And it enables us avoid India and Indian, and it enables us also not want South Asia, you know. So that's the way we would clarify this term. But of course, in a written form, a footnote or two would be necessary to explain this. Thanks for giving us the verbal footnote space.
Thank you. Would someone else like to come in with a question or a comment or a provocation? That's also possible. I am not seeing or hearing anyone asking or posing a question.
So many of us.
I have a,
yeah, okay, please go first. Yeah.
Sorry, who? Me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I just wondered if you could comment a little bit more about Wayne's last point about kind of the risks of creolization, maybe especially in the European context, because I was curious about that as well.
I don't think, if I got Wayne correctly, I don't think he was really talking about the risks of creolization so much as the risk of using the word Creole, if I'm correct.
Yes, yes, especially in that context.
Yeah, because it can be, again, used as this sort of exoticizing label, but then, you know, we are brown bodies, we are exoticized, whatever we call ourselves, you know. I don't even know what else, I mean, you know, so we have to be careful about labels that we use. For sure, this is why we are very conscious, actually, when we say Creole Indias, you know, that's the provocation we produce, because India is not thought of as Creole or capable or touched by creolization. So the term Creole Indias, or our phrase for our platform, Tinai Creole, where we use the word, a version of Creole, is certainly meant deliberately to make people sit up and think, is this even possible? What are they on about? But in every other context of explaining our work, we generally go for the processual, you know, creolization, unless, of course, as Ari does in his novel, we are speaking about a community that calls itself, or is called in its context, Creole. Then for historical accuracy, we have to call them that, you know. But it's I don't think we want to, I mean, if people are using the word Creole in a way that is simply indulging in yet another layer of exoticization of the different, then we would be alert to that, and we would, in that moment unpack the situation, hopefully, as we would if somebody was exoticizing the Orient, or what I mean. It's the same kind of work that we must be vigilant towards in any case. So
no, Ananya, let's not go far. I mean, like the French communist leader Jean-Luc Mélenchon recently used the word saying the French society is getting creolized. La société française est en train de se créoliser. Then he got some terrific backlash. People say, no, what do you mean by creolization? So you see, already France was so close to Creole and creolization, they don't want to accept that the society got creolized. So
yeah,
let's not go to India then.
No, but I think that is exactly interesting, because one cannot forget that France's relationship to creolization is also a relationship to glissant,
yes,
to chimoiseau. So it is also a relationship to creolité, and what that means. So there is also that complex politics that is also involved
Absolutely.
in that. And I think that is also the relationship between chimoiseau says something different, but it's a little bit different. The relationship between glissants and the possible investment, as I understand it, for glissant, not in creolité so much as in creolization.
Yes.
And that's exactly what it.
You're absolutely right, because I think more we use the word Creole, the more it gets complex and difficult to understand what is Creole, what is creolité, what is creolisation. Sorry, I'm just switching to French. Also, all this word, how we use it, we have to be very careful. At the same time, I think we are in the process of trying to understand. It's just a process.
Yeah.
So, we might make mistake, or we might be wrong or right. We don't know yet, because it's just a process.
The other thing which is quite important, I think, is to quickly revert to the earlier question by Wayne, which I sort of skipped over, about mobility and stasis, and I think this, for example, Ari, is very well illustrated by your own book, The Thinai, which seems like a very static novel, because all people are doing are sitting on the Thinai and exchanging stories. So it seems like the novel is really not going anywhere, but at the same time, the stories are taking us everywhere, So I think what we need to do is think about the old issue of linear time and linear temporality, which of course we know is what Coetzee, for example, calls the time of history. So we've got to think about what is, with creolization, I think we can enter different temporalities. And so the idea of mobility itself, I think, becomes reconfigured, or can become reconfigured. Who can move, who can't move, but who has moved and who's come? And so what is moving, So mobility, we all need to keep thinking again about these straight lines, which are also phenomenologically aligned to binaries, A plus B makes C kind of a thing. We therefore, when we think about creolization, it could be about, in one small space, a lot of swirled vectors. So the vector is not so much a straight line, but what happens to it when it is swirled, in this compact space. So that's the model of creolization we're thinking about. It may just be enacted by 3 people sitting on a Thinai and talking for the duration of the entire novel, but what is unfolding, the excavations, the sedimentations that are being, kind of revealed as a process, in a way that is also mobility. And it's a different model of thinking about mobility, about temporality, and about cultural, genesis, actually. So Wayne, I hope that was somehow helpful. That was a bit abstract, but
mobility is, yeah.
We have Siko, who posed a question, and then maybe I'll ask a question later on. Siko says there's a lot of background noise. So he's asking, what about Wayne's point about the politics of consumption, politics and the consumption of Creole and the processes and the future at play now? Who owns and uses Creole and creolization?
Who owns and uses creolization? Ari, any response?
What we are doing in our project in the Creole India, in the Indian space, that exactly what we're doing. It's resisting a kind of majoritarian discourse of purity. And by putting these elements of difference and different elements comes and tell different narrative and different stories, and revealing a past also, which the state is trying to erase. And we are excavating this memory just to show that these were existing. These are part of the society. These are part of our cultural heritage. So let's not erase to begin something new, saying, okay, everything started from the kind of periodization of saying, oh, it has started from here, this is what is pure, and this is how it's going to be. So with our work is what we are trying to do. And I'm saying again, I'm trying to do, is trying to say that there are other discourses other than the majoritarian discourse that you want to input into the society.
But also, I'm really intrigued by the by your question: who owns and uses? Why must the discourse of ownership be brought in? What is the meaning of owning? Why cannot we think about who accepts or who embraces or who enters creolization? You know, so I think that even this question seems to be very strangely put, to be honest, because it presupposes that there is a kind of, you know, that there is something that is only available to us as something to be owned or possessed. It's a possessive discourse. And I think that we've got to really change our way of thinking about how we relate to concepts and what they stand for. And so, of course, there can be uses and misuses, but to be honest, I find even the idea that there is an ownership of creolization, and that can itself be a question, is making me think, why cannot we all enter into co-ownership, you know, of, if we have to use the word ownership, sharing, distributing, commons, you know, there are different ways of thinking about concepts and their political use.
Zico says he should have put it between brackets because he was questioning.
Okay, that changes the matter, but
Yeah,
we talked about
was,
it, looking at
yeah.
it as if it wasn't in brackets. So
yeah, he was questioning about the. I don't know if there's other questions, otherwise I will pose one, but I don't need to pose one if other people feel the need to further respond to this. Tom, you had a question before I.
Yeah, thank
you.
you.
Yeah, please.
I apologize in advance if my children start making a lot of noise, so I'll keep it quick. Thank you. I understand the pushback that this might be getting from the Indian government, basically the 5, what is it, millennia old civilization myth that this sort of destabilizes. I was wondering what kind of pushback would this get on the level of the individual, for example, in a place like Pondicherry, in which people have, of course, this creolized legacy, but they also have had education in, you know, a certain tradition. So it might be very conflicting on an individual level. And I wonder, what can you share about that?
over to the Pondicherry person.
Yeah, I mean, yes, you're absolutely right. But see, again, the problem is the Creole community, or in Pondicherry, is on the verge of almost disappearing. You see, and in order to keep them alive, the people already moved out of the country. They either live in Canada or in France, mostly in France. The people in Pondicherry now, they don't know what Creole is about, but it becomes, now the tourism industry has taken over. It becomes so powerful that everything is Creole food, Creole this, Creole that.
Not at all.
Which is not Creole at all. So the label Creole is selling. It becomes a selling point, not as a concept or not as a historical evidence of a past. And even the new generation, they meet some people wearing a Creole dress, which normally there is a particular way of dressing. They don't know what these people are. For them, it's just they are Europeans. They don't consider them as Indians anymore or as Creole. So it is disappearing. So in order for them to keep that, that past revived, it has to go either through literature or to some kind of other way of expressing to keep them alive. So of course, we are talking about literature, but there's also food. food is another very good element to keep the tradition alive or keep that memory. So even if a person who is educated in different way or that, this is put it out there, I think you can still get some ideas of creolité or creolisation or Creole in Pondicherry.
Well, actually, I'd clarify it a bit, to be honest, because for me, it's not about keeping something alive, it's making something sustainable. So it's not about just propping something up with some injection of vitality. It has to, there has to be, if we are now talking about heritage industries, for example, there has to be a sustainability discourse, not a keeping alive discourse. But that's something a bit by and by. I see a comment there, and indeed that was in my mind, exactly, that perhaps this is what Siko was meaning when he talked about ownership, or who is owning what and who is reusing the label. But the point is, we are also not just stopping at the idea of one Creole person or two Creole people from a Ba Creole family. I'm talking about our own experiences of being part of an Indic Creolized habitus. I'm from a Muslim family. We would say, oh, we are not Creolized. I can see growing up in Calcutta, I shared in a Creolized habitus. My research is showing me that. And when we put our work out there on the Thinai Creole, the thousands of people from all over India who log on and who say, yes, we understand what you're saying, are participating in a co-owned, shared understanding of Creolization through the provocative and poetic use of the word Creole by us. But we use it, but we only use it to trigger a process of thinking about Creolization as a way to recuperate certain endangered possibilities of being in the current political climate. And if that means that also enables us to reach out and forge, reconnect with places like the Caribbean, Fiji, Indian Ocean world, where historically Indian communities went and participated in Creolization processes out there, all the better, because that is relation. That is exactly how I understand relation, to go back to another one of Wayne's comments earlier.
There are a couple of minutes more, so I plead your indulgence because David wants to ask a question, then I'll pose a comment so that you, Ari, and Wayne can riff on it so we can end that way. So David, first your question.
No, I don't have a question. I was just responding to the conversation as it was unfolding. And I think it has been already answered. I mean, Ananya got back to it.
Okay, brilliant. Let me just pose this. It's a question because as I heard everyone speak, I thought, I don't know if I think of Creolization as a process. I think it's a process which is not a process. I think Creolization might have to do with sublimation. It might have to do with condensation of things. It might have to do with theatricality, and it might have to do with displacement. So can you really de-Creolize? I don't know if there can be de-Creolization. I think that things can change.
Can you what? De-Creolize or be-Creolized?
De-Creolization. I don't know if there can be a de-Creolization if you think Creolization as this thing that is about sublimating, is about condensing, is about displacing, is about certain theatricalities or performance that Ananya was talking about. And then it brings me back to what Ari, I think, was intuiting when he spoke about the spirit and the spirits.
Yes.
With Baron Samedi. So, and then one last thing is because I recognize that when you write Thinai Creole, you write it in the Creole version of, let's say, the Haitian version of Creole, which is a kind of subalternity. Mm-hmm. So which means there's a politics in it, a politics of bringing the subaltern into the conversation. So that now, Wayne, Ananya, Ari, you ended nicely. Yeah.
I'll go first. Well, I completely agree with you on de-Creolization because I wrote an article which came out in January, or no, was it in December? Exactly that, saying that de-Creolization, so-called what looks like de-Creolization is actually re-Creolization. So I'm with you all the way. Though I do like now this provocation again, that why are we thinking of process? Why can't it be different states? So I'm going to think a little bit more about that because I think that accords very well with these mythic structures that we were trying to explore as well today. So thank you for that. But I'm with you on what is decreolization if not yet another stage or state in a meta, ongoing Creole drama. I'm trying not to use process. Okay, friends, it's yours now.
Should I go, Wayne? Or
Yes, please. Yes. Please.
No, for me, I'm keep on believing that what we do on Tine Creole, it's an act of resistance, because as I said, the creation in the Indic space is deeply connected, involved with caste marginalization. As you saw in that Chawutan Aragam, most of the people who have been, first of all, converted are from the lower caste. They are from Paria. So in order for them to escape from the from the oppression of the upper caste, they converted to Christianity, and they use this Chavitan Nadagam as a way of expressing or performing, even by using Charlemagne and Roland, whatever. But there are other forms of performances like the Vira Kumanadagam. There are different ways to express that marginalization and how they come out of that system. So for me, I use Tine Creole deliberately as an act of resistance, as I said, the poem you might have read on my post about being an African, Afro-Vidian. I call myself an Afro-Vidian, an African, an Indian, and the Dalit and the Nigger. So the Nègre et le Dalit vivent ensemble en moi.
Yeah, Francois.
Très bien. Wayne.
Yeah, Francois, thanks. Because to be honest with you, the term decreolization is not a term that is a part of my own vocabulary. So I don't even know, I wouldn't even know how to respond to that. I mean, I like you, because I studied chemistry, I like your use of the word distillation and what that might mean. I think, it allows me to go back into a different part of my own, earlier studies. So therefore the answer to your question is a simple yes. Yes, I agree with you. I'm not so sure. And I think that is exactly why I'm interested in those people who are invested in what is called mobility's paradigm. That it's a paradigm of non-stasis. You don't have to call it process, but it's a paradigm of constant otherwising. And so two things I want to leave you with is that, my investment in your conversation and what you're doing is an investment in certain theoretical theories of what we call the otherwise, and being otherwise, and how otherwise being in the world, which is always a changing thing. So that is one thing. And I want to end, which is how I always end, because if I were to take up your creolization as a form, personally, I wouldn't start out from resistance. I would start out from my good friend Bob Marley.
Yes.
Because he would say to you, we refuse to be what you want us to be. We are what we are. And that R for Bob Marley is an in motion R. Not resistance, because sometimes the Creole that you speak about is also what Jamaicans would call don't care. And don't care mean I don't care which box you want to put me in. I'm already somewhere else. So that is how I would end this. Thank you all. Thanks, wonderful Ari and Ananya for inviting me.
Thank you, Wayne. Thanks a lot.
And it's really I think the vocabulary that both of you have introduced, that's both Francio and Wayne, I think we will take back, this idea of why, of deepening being by non-stasis, which is not processual. And the different metaphors that have come out, including distillation, which was going through my mind while I was reading about Batavia Arak, and now it makes all complete sense. I think we are going to be with this for a while. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you, Ananya. Thank you, Wayne. Thank you, Ari. Thank you, everyone who was here. And on the 7th of May, that is the second installment, then we will have Jocelyn Berroir of the the super band Kassav. So there will be music, singing, and dancing, and discussing how actually, as Ananya was saying, how creolization is best understood as a performance.
The only thing, Francie, I hope there's rum. Is there rum?
This still matters.
Distillation does matter.
Yeah, but
We must, David. David, will you make
you
sure
nicely finished by talking about distillation. So we go back to Batavia Rock.
That's exactly what I said. That's exactly what I said. Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
David is the head of research at the KITLV. David, will you make sure that all the persons who show up, that there will be rum?
Your responsibility, David.
Virtual rum.
All right. Thank
You can all come to my room now here.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thanks for that.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Cheers.